Thank you for checking out In the Now Eventually Press, a home for independent writers. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also follow the link in the description to our Patreon page and become a patron for access to special bonuses. Thank you, and please enjoy the story.
For In the Now Eventually Press, Dictum Violare by Jordie Mack. Read and recorded by Stephen Dalton. Art by Burak Atta. Links for free-to-use music found in video details. Part 1. Scott Foley, age 11, badly hated his rampant pre-pubertal acne and his puckered scar, which etched across his left eye. Already dragged through the mud, he thought it unfair his most jarring feature be his nose, which appeared constricted against an invisible plate of glass, and was so disconcerting that, as he grew older, it gave off the unfortunate impression of a self-abused degenerate. At 6'2" and a wide, encumbered frame, it was an ironic predetermination that he defaulted as the bruiser or muscle of any set he found himself in. Ironic because Scott saw himself as a Ferdinand type in all ways, a peaceful, if heavy layabout, with intentions to soak up Earth's simple pleasures, but not much more. From a very young age, but starting at John Almond Catholic School, his self-tolerance for an alienating disposition became evident. In daycare, Scott was prone to slow walks along the inner rim of the playground, and whether he had a partner or not seemed a trivial matter. When other children grew older and were playing games at school, either sporting or imaginary, forming cliques and the elementary seeds of romantic partnering, or working to endear themselves to the faculty staff, Scott was decidedly neutral and regarded all these pursuits with the same monk-like indifference. A rare shining few found him to be a charming, if reserved, quirk and called him friend. But most experienced Scott as an off-putting, holier-than-thou bore, who at his core held a deep contradiction regarding his supposed neutrality. Perhaps it was due to overcompensation, but young Scott remained wholly dedicated to regiment, cleanliness, and his own idea of sophistication. It was right he was born English Catholic due to his natural aptitude for public shaming, and was such a stickler for rules that he often acted vicious. The single most infamous case of young Foley's capability for the impossible position came during a dissection of a squid in which every child was loaded with their own apple of temptation. A boy named Carl Walsh had slyly pocketed his squid and rolled it in his balled fist until it was like gelatin. He held it behind his back, and in an organic glide pitched the viscous into the center row, then clapped his palms flat on the plastic stand-in table. Cries of repulse called the acting instructor, Sister Shacourt, to investigate. Upon seeing the splattered mess on her freshly cleaned floors, she demanded to know who had thrown it, and wouldn't go to lunch until she did. 10 minutes of his complaining, jeering peers was all Scott could take before hopping down from his stool and mopping up the damage with a handful of oversized cardboard-smelling paper towels. "No, it couldn't be," the sister said. "I can't believe good Scott Foley would do such a thing." "Do such a thing?" Scott asked, tilting his head like a dog. "Yes, I can't believe you would throw that." "I didn't," Scott interrupted awkwardly. "I assure you, I'm cleaning this mess so we can move on with our lesson. I'm simply tired of being held up. But make no mistake, if I had seen the one who did it, I'd tell you right now." Some students booed and hissed, but Sister Shacourt put her hands on her hips and smirked at the boy, who she then decided was uniquely precocious and felt the need to correct past misgivings. She gestured for Scott to follow her back to the desk and opened her locked cubby to reveal a stack of manila folders. She pulled from the stack one with Scott's name written in red felt pen on the tag, and then, with that wry smirk still hooking across her face, she began pulling papers from the file and replacing lower-grade letters with B's. Perhaps it was not to come off as too lenient to give solid A's. By the time she was done, she had skimmed through nearly all the work Scott had done that year, effectively turning his grade point average up to one whole half digit. Shakehouse locked the work away again, and then said, patting Scott on the shoulder, "Scott, sometimes students deserve a Hail Mary." "A Hail Mary?" Scott asked. "Yes, a Hail—" "I know what it is," Scott interrupted awkwardly again. "Oh, anyway, I believe you deserve one for showing such good judgment. Now, how about I write you up a note of good behavior, and maybe if you show your mom, she'll bake you some cookies?" Shakehouse leaned in with a warm smile, expecting the young boy to jump for joy at the tempting offer, but instead her words froze young Scott. He said nothing, almost 8 seconds, and then spoke blankly. "May I be excused? For the bathroom." The sister was taken aback, and her gregarious demeanour quickly fell away like a toppling block tower. She obliged him, and he turned for the door and marched out, leaving Sister Sheeples not sure if she had scared the boy somehow. She returned to her class lesson. Not more than 5 minutes passed that her name was called over the intercom speaker, beckoning her to the office like a truant pupil. Trying to hide her embarrassment, she assured her students the exit would be brief and jogged down the halls to the west wing. The flustered middle-aged nun peeked her head in through the door of Father Ryan's office and saw the father rolling his thumbs together while Scott Foley sat upright and attentive in a chair before him, not even turning around to look at his teacher. "Sister, do you mind coming and taking a seat for just a second?" She sat down next to Scott, turned to him with a smile, but received no glance. "So, what have you two been discussing?" "Well, sister, it just so happens that Scott here says that you gave him an illegal leg up on the homework game. Those aren't exactly your words, Scott, but is that about what happened, would you say?" Ryan gestured to Scott, who chewed on the inside of his lip for a moment before answering. "Yes, she tried to bribe me by fixing all my grades." "Bribe you?" Sister Shakecourt's mouth came agape in incredulous amusement. "What was I bribing you for, Scott? If you didn't want the help, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you feel patronized." "She thinks just because I cleaned up for someone else that she can turn me into her class snitch. That's why I believe she did that, to bribe me to become her spy, a class snitch." "Ha!" Sister Shakecourt stared at Scott in total disbelief. "Son, I appreciate your dedication to accountability. I truly do. I'm afraid that you should appreciate what your good instructor has done for you. You're being very resentful now, and she was only helping you. Do you understand, Scott?" The child's eyes grew wide in astonishment, his buckled arms which became unfurled. He leaned forward nearly off the edge of his seat and shook his head in answer to the question. "Well, Sister Shakecourt has a lot of work on her plate as a teacher, and children, as sweet as they can be, don't always make her job any easier. Now, I don't recommend she make a habit out of it, but if she saw fit to reward an exemplary student, I will trust her good judgment when she goes about it. If you still feel that the good sister has done something sinful, maybe that's something to think about, even pray on. So, is there anything you'd like to say?" He gently gestured at the sister, who herself turned towards Scott in an upright posture to formally accept the child's apology. He only glanced up at her for a moment, and to her he seemed blank, as if he were still processing information, like a punched card computer. He turned back to Father Ryan and pointed towards the phone on his desk. "May I please make a phone call?" Ryan, caught off guard, could only then nod his head and nudge the old rotary across the table. Scott nodded and picked up the receiver and added, "I'm going to need your Rolodex as well. We'll see how the superintendent feels about this. I only hope this doesn't go all the way to the diocese." Shacourt and Ryan locked eyes, almost expressionless for a time, and then bursts of hysterical laughter so jarring it surprised Scott. He dropped the receiver and covered his ears. The father assured Scott he could write the Pope when he got home, but until then to keep his moral outrage tamped down. Before the end of the week, the entire staff had heard the story, and to this day it remains a bit of John Almond culture. But in truth, there were many other incidents similar to, but not so anecdotal, as the diocese squid story. There was the time he tripped Tyler Finlance just for running in the hallway, and when Tyler got up and asked Scott to fight him, Scott immediately ran away and told a teacher. If one of his peers' items were ever out of place, or a staff member for that matter, rather than putting it back, he would simply pocket it as punishment. Wait till they figured out he took it, and then explain why they shouldn't leave their things around. Maybe, worst of all, Scott would yell at people for putting away library books in the wrong spot, no matter their age, and was known for making the much younger children cry this way. Yet he felt no remorse. Through the years, he grew more into his role as a pariah to both his peers and instructors, and proved to many that one can cause great havoc through strict adherence to lawfulness. If there were ever one who littered, whispered during class, came late, cheated or plagiarized, broke dress code, or jogged too slow during PE, then they had assured a chiding lecture from Scale-Face Scott, as was the teacher on duty that let the infraction slide. By the time he had finished high school, he was known as a narc, a buzzkill, or an asshole. As he matured into a young adult, in his years as an inebriated socialite, he then would be called an unscrupulous Nazi, and at his most desperate moments resembled a thick-skinned oaf, incapable of empathy. And sometimes he could be. But despite the seeming total lack of whimsy displayed by his character, Scott was joked at often for being a believer in the paranormal. He collected books on UFOs, undocumented creatures living in the wilds of the world, and unexplained phenomenon, as described by the witness. Many children find interest in such things, but Scott was a devotee. And due to this, he was made more susceptible to pranks or tricks designed to scare poor Scott. One night, during second year of high school, he was confronted by a group of boys waiting for him in the hallways, all wearing masks and costumes, and chased him down into a corner. Scott screamed all the way, and after they revealed themselves to him, noticed he had urinated himself. The boys naturally tried to beat him up, but laughed far too hard. He was teased mercilessly for months, yet he felt no shame for the way he had reacted to their bullying. "I don't care," he'd say proudly whenever the subject of his pant-wetting was brought up. "I don't care if I peed my pants because I was really scared. Because unlike all of you, who don't really believe in weird, I've actually seen something weird in real life." "Nuh-uh," they'd say. "Yeah-huh, but go ahead, don't believe me, I'm still right." The conversation would end there because he knew in his heart it was true. And it was. Scott Foley, age 11, had met something within the old walls of John Almond one night, something most people never chance to meet even in 2 lifetimes, and even in his young age, he understood that. He understood also it was the kind of thing that should never, ever cross him again. But it did. Part 2. The Pacific Northwest, August 27th of 2008. Scott Foley, age 42. The time, 3:15 a.m. A sweltering heat and humidity brought precipitation like rain to the windows of Scott's enclosed security booth. He dabbed his face with the ends of an already damp t-shirt, taking special care around his cheek scar, where he most disliked the sensation. In a fit of cabin fever, he walked out of the booth and came up to the gate, which sealed off the great Shokawa Nature Conservatory and Park, and gripped its metal bars to feel the heat they still emanated. Despite the sun having been down for hours, they still felt warm. Then, as he always did when he came up this close, had to press his head further through the bars and peer down into the Shokawa River below, and gawked at the terrible 200-foot drop. Jesus, he mouthed silently, and wiped his forehead clean of fresh sweat as he came back into his incubator, where he noticed a cricket hopping its way in. "It's nice to have visitors," he said to it, then took a seat, and finally remembered to kiss the cross around his neck and apologize for using the Lord's name in vain. During the day, his job was active, but during nights, purely meditative. Like working in a steam sauna, in an isolation tank. But Scott would bring along cookies sent by his mother and stacks of magazines, even an emergency unopened pack of cigarettes, just in case. Tobacco helped take the edge off whenever he felt like a lab rat. Most nights, admittedly, saw Scott avoiding the problem by crossing his arms, dipping his head into his barrel-wide chest, and falling unconscious for hours at a time, with the running Shokawa River 50 feet below acting as white noise. Because of this habitual on and off sleeping, he could not be sure of what occurred, or may not have occurred, during the night of the initial encounter. The first thing Scott noticed were the way its headlights shone in the dark. Ordinarily, Scott could tell someone approaching from half a mile away, as the corner which turns onto Scott's trail was so dark and tight that it accentuated high beams. So, unless a car had turned its headlights clear off, there was no surprise in your arrival. A car had turned onto the road and was approaching, yet Scott had not seen it coming. Strange, Scott thought, as he peered down at the car's lights and how they had no shine but rather glow, like two pieces of moon rock replaced its bulbs. Odder still was the sound the car made. Most cars these days had engines which prioritized quiet, and even some that no longer ran on diesel gas. What was so strange about the approaching car was the lack of engine sound altogether. Yes, the abundance of mechanical error. It sounded as though the car were filled with wrenches and scrap metal, tumbling into each other and thrown apart by whatever remains of the inner limbs still function. It was a terrible grinding and scraping sort of noise, at once emitting high-pitched squeal and the low, repetitious ka-thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk of a broken dryer. Yet the car did not stop and go like the Model T it impersonated. In fact, in it glided across the room in a smooth tween and then stopped weightlessly at the security booth. Scott came to his feet and looked down at the driver of the car, which now could be identified as an outdated Audi Quattro, then took a step by, startled by what he saw. The man's face had already been tilted toward the booth window, and his expression was that of unmistakable sorrow. He reminded Scott of the masks of Sock and Buskin, with the exaggerated grief of a mourner and eyes which remained forever locked by tears. The vision was so immediately unnerving that Scott forgot his script as he began his greet. "Hello, sir, sir, do you require assistance? Are you all right, sir?"
"My girls. I've got to see my girls. Let me see them."
The man in the car spoke through his tears, his jaw unhinged, cocking to either side, and his eyes pressed tightly closed. "Your girls? Are you reporting lost children? Sir, please remain calm, and everything will be fine. Would you like me to call the police? Are you a loved one in danger?"
"My girls!"
the man shouted, followed by a sputtering of half-whimpers, and then again,
"I have to help them. I don't want to imagine what might happen to them."
Scott was to reassure him that he'd be all right, but his words fell back into his throat as he came to realize that the man had barely moved, if at all, since they'd met. His face was so still, so uncannily frozen in place, it began to turn Scott's stomach just a tad. Not only that, but the way his tears fell from his face in two uniform paths, dropping on a perfect rhythm and in time. But then his eyes were not red and puffy at all, but his complexion was entirely uniform, and that too looked wrong, because it was poreless and slick like a wax sculpture. And his eyes, he hadn't opened his eyes once.
If I don't find my girls,
Scott became unnerved and unconsciously turned his back on the man. He desperately reached for the phone and dialed his superior, holding the receiver so tightly to his head it pained him. The phone rang once, twice, a third time, a fourth, and then, "Leave a message." Scott rolled his eyes and shakily called out from over his shoulder, "Just a moment, sir. I'll have this straightened out soon." When he called back at the man, something seemed wrong, for he heard no response, nor weeping, nor stalling engine, and so he looked again, and saw nothing. The receiver fell to the ground as Scott leaned out the window and stuck his head into the humid air. Down the way, past his gate by 5 meters, he could see the 2 tail lights descending, but then seeming to vanish. He rubbed his eyes and blinked hard as they do in old movies, just to test it out. The car was gone. He saw it not 15 feet away before it evaporated. Or, he thought, perhaps the man had simply turned off his lights and thus become invisible along the shadowy road. Only he couldn't hear the battered engine anymore, and even more off, the gate had remained closed the entire time. Scott, stupefied, pushed his cap to the side as he scratched his crown, evoking the hapless police officer with his baton and dumbstruck expression. It had all happened fast, but in the ensuing silent loneliness of the remaining graveyard shift, Scott felt terribly alone and sat pressed up in the far corner of his booth, not exposing his back to any of the windows. Part 3. Even as a lad at John Almond, Scott found himself doubting that the staff could do as good a job as he, had their positions been swapped. When he tried expressing this and made suggestions to the staff, he quickly became worn out by their double talk and placating shine-ons. It wasn't until Scott joined the workforce at age 21, after spending some time studying communication, that he truly had his mind rocked by the implications of a hard and fast set of standards in a high-stress environment. The first job was going to be temporary as a food prep in a local burger restaurant known as Golden Brown's Hash, but the relationship he garnered with the manager was so thrilling he practically had to tear himself away when the time finally came. When Mr. Dabrowski said work harder, Scott obliged twofold. But when Scott suggested a change in method to make work easier, then as long as it was plausible and cost-effective, which Scott always made sure it was, old Mr. Dabrowski obliged, and what proceeded became a golden era. The experience may have spoiled him. He left the job with such a high optimism towards life that he was never able to capture again as naturally and with such ease. But it did leave him with a promise of what could be. A promise that would overshadow the relationships of all superior officers throughout his entire working career. His next job as a dock worker in North Carolina was also to be temporary, but ended up lasting longer than his time at Golden's, and came to define his finely fixed outlook and attitude, where the image of the day was often a dead seagull encased in ice. The job was exhausting and introduced many new kinds of attitudes and mindsets among his co-workers that he hadn't encountered in his hitherto sheltered life, some unsavory or surly, and some morbidly comforting as a marker to compare his own place in society's chain of value. Although he did look like one of them, Scott was effectively outed as something completely other. On the third day of work, his personality came into full view and established a dynamic, one in which he was the character that always had something to say, and everyone else were there to tell him no. In fact, his boss at this time, Mr. Jed Williams, was already so fed up with Scott by the fourth week of work that he was shouting and threatening dismissal and remained at that pitch for the next 3 years as he oversaw Scott and yet never fired him, and in fact wanted to take a photo with Scott during his send-off pizza party. Later on, Jed would display that photo over his mantle, like he did with his visits to natural wonders. After North Carolina, there was Kentucky, where he worked as a barista, of all things, in his shortest stint to date, and without any word to anyone, packed up one day and tried out Chicago next, ending up in the kitchen of a fine hotel and then a market deli, and then blew out of the windy city like a westbound tumbleweed, bouncing across the northern regions of the United States until reaching the shore in Washington state. He had never been to a place quite like the Pacific Northwest before. Its natural beauty generated a culture of tranquility, yet also instilled in them an expectation for the highbrow, which kept Scott on his toes and intrigued him with its novelty. He could afford to rent a small house in a humble part of town with the money he'd saved and found a job as a barista, but soon discovered a listing for a nature conservatory watchman. It was explained, during the interview, the gig wasn't so exciting as the title. He would remain stationary and locked between 4 walls of metal and plexiglass, which saw him a bit crestfallen. After discussing the parameters of the job and the long hours required, Scott thought to pass on the job, if it were not for the charm of the interviewer. "Have you ever had work as a lab experiment before?" he asked. The man reminded Scott of a tomato, so short and plump, and tight balls in his cheeks, as if he carried his stress there. He looked at Scott through tight, squinted eyes, which were somehow not severe but warm, despite not appearing warm. "No, never," Scott said, sitting across the desk. "That's just fine. You know, you're better for the control group that way. How about attendant work? If not, maybe some endurance meditation?" The man's red, bushy eyebrows squished down into his face whenever he made a joke, helping cue a polite laugh from Scott. "No, I've never worked at a park either, sir, and I don't meditate either, if that was an earnest question." "What, do you have something against it?" "I was raised in a Catholic boarding school, and then I went to college, and I've been on the road a lot since. It just never came up." "Well, you'd be willing to sit still for money, right?" "Of course, everyone needs money." He shuffled his papers on his desk and looked out at who knows what. "How would you generally describe your working relationships with past supervisors?" "I always quit on my own accord, and the relationships have always been amicable." "Amicable?" the tomato man asked, and bristled his chin with his thumb. "Amicable might be generous. I say what I feel, and I don't want to be told I'm wrong unless it's accurately explained to me. I tell people what I think should be done. Sometimes that can cause conflict, but I'm not afraid of that." The man regarded Scott so that he felt studied and analysed, and Scott then realised he had gotten too comfortable. He had broken the cardinal rule of interviewing. Lying is good. Rather than continuing to speak, he quietly nodded and waited for the next question. "That sounds interesting, Scott. You sound like an interesting man. What about your friends? Do they quarrel with you?" the man asked, probably knowing the answer already. "That's not an appropriate question for a job interview." "I suppose it isn't. Still, you seem to me like a Lone Ranger. You'd be great for this job, 'cause you're good going solo. The Lone Ranger, Lone Wolf. Yeah, I bet you entertain yourself just fine." "That is somewhat accurate, though the idea of wolves as solitary creatures have been disproven." "All right, well, scratch that, not Lone Wolf. And let me clarify, the Lone Ranger wasn't antisocial or nothing. He was just content with himself, you know? Do you feel content with yourself? Scott asked, not meaning to be brazen, but out of instinctive habit to parrot others in conversation. Am I? The man's right eyebrow peaked. That's not something you ask when you're trying to land a job. You started it. Well, he folded his hands on his lap thoughtfully. I suppose I do feel contented when I'm working. I feel great. When I'm a man on a mission, that's being content. Otherwise, I can get kinda floaty. When I have something to attack, and I'm knowing I'm making a difference, that's good. And are you attacking very many missions lately? Scott cocked his head to the side. I used to. I used to get to tackle people's problems practically every day. Lately, though, there's a lot of friggin' hold-up. The goddamn planning director always feeding me the same caca about, I need to certify this or validate that. But it's just busy work to keep me going in circles and never get anything done. And when I try to file a complaint, it gets ignored. So when I speak up during town hearing, they just have me removed for being loud at the hearing. And man, don't even get me started on the rest of parks and recreation. They have their heads so far up their asses. I mean, they're talking about building even more timeshares and... forget it. If I start ranting about the system, I'll just end up with breaking my diet. So then, Scott said, maybe you understand the relationship I often have with my superiors? Huh? How's that? Sir, when I am given a job, I am not just an employee. I'm a partner. And that's not pride speaking. It's just pure common sense, from a business standpoint. The man breathed deeply, looking over Scott with amusement. A moment later, he reached across the table and asked to shake hands. His name was Mr. Arnold Duncan, and Scott was excited to work for him over the summer. Part 4. Hey! I said hello. Is anyone home? The needling voice pulled Scott's conscience out from the dark, as did the staticky, out-of-range radio rock coming from the visitor's car. Scott sprung up from the puddle of sleep spit amassing on the top of his hands and pulled aside the drapes, which always looked to Scott like emergency room curtains, to reveal the bright light of day stinging his eyes. The visitor to the conservatory sat parked beside the security booth in a red convertible, scrolling through his smartphone and fidgeting with his gear shifter. I apologize for that, sir. It's been a long night. Scott's voice was croaky, and his eyes were wet like a hound dog's. Oh my God, are you drunk? The blonde gym rat lifted his shades and squinted his entire face at Scott, who jerked at the accusation. Jesus, look at your face. Drunk? No, I'm at the end of a 14-hour shift overnight. My boss will be here any minute to take over. Please bear with us. Scott couldn't help but yawn and stretch his arms. If I were you, I'd just sleep in the booth anyway, the visitor said. Well, sir, last night there was an illegal breach last night, Scott said and wiped the crust from his eyes. I think. Security breach? The visitor shook his head as he scrolled through his phone. What happened? Did Bambi break out? Don't know. It was probably just some vandals, Scott said. Vandals? You mean graffiti artists? What, all the way out here? You said they're on your property? The visitor lifted himself up above the windshield and eagerly peered through the gate ahead. That's interesting. I might make a solid connect over the weekend, and I thought this trip was gonna be boring. You think Carthage, Washington is boring? Scott said clearly, the frog in his throat gone. The Shokaia Nature Conservatory is anything but boring. In fact, here at the Shokaia River, we pride ourselves as the guardians of Washington's best-kept secret. The park's beauty is no less than a natural wonder. Once I let you pass the gate, you'll drive over a big bridge overlooking the beautiful Shokaia River before entering the park grounds. Be sure to pull over and take a look over the edge. Sure is a big drop. Okay. The visitor sat back in his seat and was touching his phone again, ignoring Scott. That's right. Its wide berth and slow, gentle rapids are truly a sight to behold, with a 200-foot drop from above. Do yourself a favor, pull over, appreciate the view. Uh-huh. I think you said that already. Hey, listen, I don't mean to cut you off or anything, but it feels like 100 degrees out here with the top down. Can we speed this up? The infinity pool is calling me. Absolutely, sir. If you would just give me your ID to inspect, I'll have you on your way. Scott pushed forward the slot for receiving cards and payment as the man reached in his swimming trunks and pulled from it a California driver's license, then slipped it through into the slot. Scott opened up a small brown leather-bound journal and marked down the information from the card, along with the time and date and the make and model of his vehicle. All right, Mr. Cranville, or do you prefer Blake? I don't want to talk long enough for it to matter. Fair enough. If you can just tell me the address of where you're headed, I'll mark it down here and throw open the gate. The address? The address of where you're headed, unless you're planning on just free camping, in which case you'd tell me which designated area you're in. I'm not camping, dude. The address is, hold on. I think she said it was on, I think it's called Indian Hairbrush Trails, right? You mean Indian Paintbrush Trails? Sure. Scott scratched his nose, then peered back down at the paper, then back at the young lad. And the house number? Dude, I just gave you the street. Isn't that good enough? I can't let you through unless I receive the full street address, for security purposes. I don't know, man. It wasn't my job to remember that. It wasn't your job to know where you're driving to? It doesn't matter anyway. I mean, security? You already said people are breaking in left and right at this place. I did not say that. Look, the phone service is so bad out here, GPS would be useless, even if I did know the address, okay? Because, listen, the plan was that I follow the main road and my friend Veronica said there'd be a big yellow coffee shop like 5 miles in, can't miss it. I'm meeting her there. She could take me back to the place. Just let me through, man, come on. You can follow me. He removed his cheap sunglasses and put his hands together like a pleading child. Scott scratched his nose again, then picked up the pencil. Last question. Are you with the delivery company? What do you think, man? Then I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to turn around. Turn around? I have driven 500 miles to be here. Hella far. Blake gripped the convertible's driver's side door and shook it back and forth. It's for security purposes, sir. Scott tapped his badge sternly. No one can come in without declaring where they're lodging, in case of an emergency. How could we locate you? You either have to give me an exact address, or at least tell me which of the designated areas you're camping in. Designated areas? The man stopped punching the air and looked as though he had an idea. Yeah, I'm camping. I'm staying in designated area A. That is not a thing, sir, Scott replied. And you just told me you were staying in one of the houses. I got it wrong. I'm in the camping area A. There's a designated area Alpaca. Is that what you meant? Since it starts with an A? That is what I meant, sir. Great. Scott erased something on the paper, then filled in something else. Then I'll just have to take a look at your camping gear. Sorry for the inconvenience. I didn't bring it. My friend brought it. Also, I just camp on the ground outside, so I'm set. All good. Just let me in now. Sir, I can't let you through without first meeting our requirements for safe camping. If your friend brought your gear, he should have given me your name when he got signed in. I'm afraid you'll just have to go buy some and come back. Come on. The guy hit the inside of his car door and made it look like it hurt. He expected Scott to make a mockish grin, but saw that his pain caused Scott no pleasure, or grief for that matter. Sir, please do not act out aggressively, okay? I am just here to enforce the rules, not make them. Now, would you like an ice pack for your hand? You know what? Screw this. He threw his car in reverse and revved the engine. You said your boss was coming soon? All right, I'll just wait for him. Let's see what he has to say about your fascist little gatekeeping. I'm gonna park my car in that patch of grass over there and wait. Is that cool, huh? Is that cool with you if I just go sit in agony over in the corner by the dumpsters during the hottest, driest day of the summer? That's fine, Scott said. Blake lifted off the brake and twisted his convertible around into the cramped and smelly parking space, leaving a small dust storm in his wake. Scott leaned back in his chair, kicked his feet up, and returned to his stack of outdated issues of Time, Clinton-era stuff. He was in the middle of a review for the 1998 Oscar nominees when the familiar little red Chevy popped into view. It pulled up next to the booth and rolled down its tinted window, revealing an exhausted 4'8" tomato with a lit cigar hanging precariously in the corner of his mouth. "Scotty, who is that there parked by the trash?" Mr. Duncan gestured towards the convertible with his outstretched thumb. "Mr. Duncan, that there is an unidentified visitor, as defined by the most updated Shokawa security manual that got re-emailed last week." "That guy didn't have no ID." "Sir, he did have a driver's license with him, yes, sir," Scott said. "So what?" he shrugged. "Well, he couldn't supply an address." "You're telling me this guy has no idea where he's going?" "Well, he knows he's headed to Indian Paintbrush, which I did mark down in the logbook, along with the fact." "Yeah, buddy, I'm sure you did mark it down, but why didn't you let him through? How long has he been just sitting there? Did you even give him any water? Are we going to be on the news?" "Sir, I didn't let him through because he did not supply me with an address." "So, let him say he's going camping." "Nor did he have the proper camping gear. He had none. Everyone has to meet code, right?" "Meet code? You make it sound so much more serious than it is, Scotty. Like it's life or death." "It could be, sir." "I'm asking you, honestly. That's how you're doing this? You think this is good for my health?" "I'm just trying to do the job, Mr. Duncan, and—" Scott stopped himself, sighed, and let down his defenses. "To make any more excuses would be an act of pure vanity. You have a lot on your plate as it is." "You have no idea. I'm about to start my countersue on the planning director that, if I win, we could potentially have as much power as they do when it comes to deciding what gets built on the Shokeo grounds, i.e. no more big, fat, ugly timeshares, and instead I can finally build the Duke." The Duke. That's what Arnold Duncan called his theoretical obstacle course, the one he's dreamed about building on Shokawa grounds for almost 10 years. "My dream. Kids would actually enjoy being here, and adults could use it too. But we could put everything in there. Ropes, slides, monkey bars, rooms filled with nothing but those plastic balls, rooms where you play tic-tac-toe, the whole 9 yards. You should have those metal pipes where you talk into one side and you can hear what's on the other side." "Huh? Never mind. Guess you never ran into one of those." "Hey, throw it in. We'll get everything. But I gotta win first. The whole thing could take weeks, Scotty. It could take months. I need to conserve as much mental and emotional energy as possible. I need to be on my A-game and stay on it. Are you on your A-game, Scott, or are you holding back the Duke?" No, I totally understand that, sir, but if I could just—
"And this,"
Mr. Duncan cut Scott off, pointing back at the red convertible and its miserable passenger.
"This is something I most certainly do not need in my life. You said he was going to Indian Paintbrush? There are 3 houses on that damn street, and you know it. It's a tiny little cul-de-sac. If he's there, we'll see his car. I'm sure you wrote down his plate numbers in that book of yours. So, come on, man. Is it worth it?"
Scott rubbed the top of his head. Mr. Duncan reached up and placed a fist against the plexiglass.
"Just help me out. I know you can do it."
Scott nodded his head 2-3 times and said slowly, "I will see what I can do, sir."
"You can do it. That's why I made you partner." He winked. "Hey, yo!" Blake honked his horn. "Is that the guy? Yo, are you the guy?" Excuse me, sir, just 1 minute, Scott shouted back, and then to his boss. I'm sorry, Mr. Duncan, but just one more thing before we move on. I'm afraid there might be a malfunction with the gate.
Oh, God, don't tell me it's not opening again. Mr. Duncan rubbed his forehead. Matteo was just out here last week.
No, I think it's the opposite problem, actually. Well, I'm not sure, but it might be opening on its own.
Scott turned around, took his oversized brass key, unlocked the booth, and stepped outside. The sound of crickets and river water grew twice in volume, but the air was less humid, and the breeze helped air out his sweat-laden shirt. Mr. Duncan tossed the end of his cigar in the dirt and watched Scott walk 130 feet up to the brass gate, grab a hold of its center rails, and shook it hard, producing a loud clanging. Well, if it's not already broke, Mr. Duncan called out.
Haha.
Scott threw himself off the rails and walked back inside the booth.
Maybe you should come in here and take a look at the electronics. There could be a glitch in the wiring or something.
Glitch in the wiring? Lad, you haven't even told me what happened first. Scott sighed.
I had a visitor come very late last night, sometime around 3:30 in the morning. That's all fine, but it's just I don't remember letting him through. I didn't get his ID, and I didn't get his destination. I just turned around for a second, and when I looked back, he was on the other side of the gate.
What? How long were you turned around for?
I don't know. I suppose it was really brief, I think.
You think? And what for?
I don't remember.
Arnold folded his arms.
The visitor in his car, he was just malevolent, that's all.
Really? He wanted to rob you?
No. He wasn't criminally threatening. Come on, haven't you ever been made nervous by someone's general personage before?
Oh, sure. Almost every time we meet. Mr. Duncan grinned at his own joke. You should know, Scott. It's practically tradition at this point for the overnight security to carry a flask. I know I did in my day, but I really would prefer if you could wait till you're off duty. Now, I wouldn't fire you over it, but...
No, Mr. Duncan. I was sober, and I'm sorry this sounds like nonsense, but if you'd just take another minute, I know you'll see the gate's not functioning.
Oh, the gate's not functioning. Scott had a weird visitor, and what next? Did you see a UFO?
Mr. Duncan, listen.
Hey! Blake started laying on his horn. I'm still over here. I thought you said 1 minute. Yes, Duncan called back, but couldn't be heard over the sound of the blaring horn. He turned to Scott and said, Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. Chances are you dreamed it, buddy.
What if that guy got into the park? We don't even know who he is, and he was really weird.
I'm sure it will be fine. You know, not everyone is like that psycho from 98 with the kids in the back of his damn truck, you know? 99.99% of people are just good folk trying to have a good time.
What kids? In what trunk?
Scott said, and then turned away and wiped his lips as if cleaning the question from his mouth.
Actually, I don't really want to know.
Mr. Duncan grinned. I need to deal with that kid's honking now, Scott, but remember what I said. Be a good partner.
I promise, sir.
Scott flipped up the gate switch, flashed his boss a thumbs up. Arnold reached his hand out the window and waved to the car behind him, which promptly ended its honking. The red convertible peeled out and followed Mr. Duncan through the open gate doors, slowing down only to flip Scott the finger. Scott waved back and watched them drive down the bridge and then into the forest green of the park as the automatic brass gates swung softly back together. Scott finished out his shift that day and drove home, pondering whether it was even possible for him to abstain from pressing the rules. He didn't want to make life any harder for Arnold Duncan. He wanted to give him all the support he could in fighting his enemies, and eventually seeing the Duke. But Scott knew that at this moment he could never back down from a broken regulation. In fact, it was virtually impossible. Like he knew it in his DNA. That's who he was. As he fell asleep that night after a dinner omelette and a double dose of NyQuil, he entered a deep sleep and woke up with an idea, like a light bulb turned on in a dream. The next few months, Scott made good on his promise to Mr. Duncan and never caused him undue grief because of an issue with a visitor. When someone arrived at Chokewa but couldn't supply an address, he'd personally drive them 7 minutes away to the nearest miracle spot, where often their phones would inexplicably find some reception. In lieu of an ID, Scott would take them to that same spot that they could call a friend from and ask for a photo of their ID. Just as long as Scott had someone on record, he figured they weren't liable. And when encountering the varying infractions which he was unprepared for, i.e. visitors with unregistered pets, firearms, or fireworks, Scott never let his pride fall so low that he considered calling his boss for longer than half a minute, and always found a creative solution to verify or negotiate, and eventually get them through the gate in a way that satisfied both parties, no matter how time-consuming or emotionally taxing it was for Scott. He made things work, for once, between himself and his superiors, by pure force of will and denial of pain. On the days in which he was required to drive several people to the miracle spot, speeding all the way there and back to make sure he hasn't left his post for too long, he'd lay in bed and reflect on the incredible energy he'd put out and marvel at himself. It was so good going, in fact, that Mr. Duncan couldn't help but notice. He took time out of his schedule to give his employees a present. He told his 8-person staff to meet at Joey's Pizza, 10 miles out from the reservation, because he needed help moving an animatronic he purchased from them. When his guests arrived, they discovered there was nothing to do but enjoy pizza, beer, and arcade games on the house, thanks to their generous boss. In particular, Joey made a big deal, making sure everyone had met their lonely security man, Scott Foley, and to know that he was his favorite. "You used to be the guy who wanted everyone to be perfect. No, you know a little wiggle room's okay. That's called growth, my friend." And while that wasn't entirely true, and Scott couldn't internally accept the good graces of his boss because of this, his new working style had become a very serious point of personal pride. He wasn't just the guy who wanted everyone to follow the rules. He wanted them to get their way, too. And his boss never had to know. A year passed. Mr. Duncan, overworked with the countersue attempt, let his eyebrows grow out in wild grey bushes that better matched his moustache. Scott adopted 2 new Tom Clancy novels into his list of favourite books. Michael Jackson, Patrick Swayze, and Farrah Fawcett all passed away, and the H1N1 virus prompted Scott to begin wearing a medical mask and gloves to work, for a little while at least. When dropping by on Sundays, Mr. Duncan would give his star employee plenty of attaboys, despite never knowing the lengths Scott was truly going to keep their relationship copacetic. Occasionally, he'd even ask the old boy out to join him for a drink on the river, or a nice salmon fillet. Scott would graciously turn him down, presuming that his boss was only being polite and best to spend his time taking care of much more important matters. On late summer nights, working the booth, though, Scott was sometimes liable to scratch his head and mumble words like darn and shoot, visualizing how nice it would be to have someone to pass the time with. Not his boss, necessarily, but a hypothetical that enjoys a game of bridge to the sound of crickets and FM radio, and is partial to the same brand of mother's cookies. With his legs and hands both crossed and chin resting in his chest, he might doze off now and then, oftentimes engaged with his imaginary friend while doing so. One night, Scott was leaning back in his flexible office chair, losing consciousness, his eyelids flickering as if giving butterfly kisses to the sweet summer air. A light shone from outside as his nearly closed eyes made a strobe effect in his vision, which pulled him out of his hallucinatory sleep. The light was coming from a car just down the way. A dull, blush light shone with no warmth. It approached the booth gradually, like a fog drifting in, and the silent way in which it floated forward brought the hairs on the back of Scott's neck to stand at attention. He noticed he could hear more than just the river and crickets. but also an obscene and looping industrial slam, like wrenches in a dryer. It didn't sound as though it was coming from the car. It sounded distant, coming from below. Scott's eyes adjusted, and he could better see the make and model. An Audi Quattro, August 27th, the same day. Had it really been a year? He couldn't be sure. He'd almost forgotten it ever happened in the first place, but the memory came rushing back just as the car came to a stop at Scott's booth, and the sound of broken metal ceased. Scott braced himself, remembering the bizarre, stretched-out scream the driver wore upon his face. But when Scott caught sight of the man, he was happily underwhelmed. On the contrary, this visitor bore no expression whatsoever and stared straight forward like a royal guard. He mechanically turned his head to face Scott and kept his face completely still as he spoke. "Hello, good sir. It is a pleasant night we are having. I have an appointment tonight." His voice was not cracking or wailing like in Scott's faded memory, but completely edgeless and dull. It was also deep and a little froggy, but where Scott took most concern wasn't in the way he spoke, rather in the way he seemed to not be speaking. This is to say that as he watched the words form on the man's lips, the words were not heard but for a moment later, as if a poorly placed audio track were off sync with the video. He formed the words, "Hello, good sir," and then only after did Scott hear it. Scott smiled back and nodded at the man. His hands were shaking in his pockets. "We're arriving pretty late, aren't we? Hope you had a safe drive, but I hate to tell you, unless you're already signed in, the gate is already closed. Now, if you can wait until 5:30, I can sign you in, but you can't wait here." Scott clasped his hands sympathetically and took a step back away from the window, positioning himself to end the interaction. The man in the car showed no reaction on his face, but slipped into the breast pocket of his denim jacket and produced a leather wallet. "Would you like to see a picture of my girls?" he said, still slightly off sync with his lips. "I have 2 beautiful daughters with my wonderful wife. Twins. I wouldn't trade them for the world." It baffled. The contrast to the sentimental words being spoken, and the complete lack of emotion they were spoken with. Something about the pitch-black leather wallet held so still in the hand swayed Scott from taking it. "I don't want to know what's in there," he thought. He hoped changing the subject would work. "I tell you, that car of yours sure is a classic. I remember my mother drove one just like it back in '87, but I can't say it was quiet. What kind of engine did you get in there? Intel? Whirlpool?" The visitor said nothing, but retracted his wallet. Scott waited a moment for a response, but he did not receive so much as a blink. Regardless, he pushed on. "Sorry, people tell me I shouldn't try to joke. In all seriousness, there could actually be something wrong with your vehicle. Car trouble is not something you want to have out here in the mountains. Let me tell you, get a mechanic to look at it ASAP." "What a wealth of knowledge you are." The visitor's eyes for once widened with some emotion, and his voice was on track with his mouth, but his pitch was now much lower, and his cadence was almost a drone. "I hope that was a free appraisal." Scott stammered. "I better call my manager." He turned around and picked up the receiver to pretend he was calling Mr. Duncan, but out of pure instinct and an overcoming sense of déjà vu, he froze from the hips up. No, this time he won't turn away. "On the other hand," Scott said, putting down the receiver, "why bother the sergeant when a cadet will suit just fine, right?" Scott laid his hands on the windowsill and gripped it like a roller coaster safety bar. "Here we go." "I have an appointment," the man said with the same deep register, "and it's your job to let me through." "I'm afraid it is not. It's my job to vet hopeful guests. I am to let enter only those who meet a certain number of criteria, and nothing less." "I have an appointment, and you are to let me through."
like last time." "Aha!" Scott waggled his finger. "So it is you. You got in by yourself last time. I don't know how, and you might have thought I forgot, but as a matter of fact, I didn't. So, you can either sit here all night, or you can wait for another miracle like last time." Scott let go of his theoretical roller coaster handle and folded his arms like a tightly wrapped cigarette and pushed them in and under his chest, puffing out his pecs and accentuating his forearm muscles. He took a pose of firmness and resilience. It was quickly shaken. For the first time since he'd arrived, the pale man's face began to substantially change. Change is the principal word because it was not dissimilar to an ink stain morphing in shape and size. The eyebrows on his face moved as free agents, swimming to the top of his forehead and then listlessly floating like amoeba. His eyes grew wide, and then too wide, exposing the pink and red underneath, as if some invisible someone were now holding his eyelids open, while his mouth stretched and curved into what could only be graciously called a smile. "Can I please come in?" He spoke in an entirely new rhythm and tone, this time a bit saccharine and overly pleasing, as if speaking to a 6-year-old through a television camera. Scott's throat locked up as he tried to speak. He was frozen, still processing the way his features swam across his skin or stretched beyond capacity. His arms fell to the side now as he experienced a shaking in his chest and legs he hitherto did not know existed. "Let me in, and I'll do you a favor next time." "Sir, no," Scott said firmly. "I'm afraid I don't need any favors, except for you to drive home now. Good night." "Oh boy, but don't you want to know what it is?" The thing said, not the visitor, the thing. Scott's hands fell to his legs and gripped them and shook his head no, but there was no taking it for an answer. The man's face shifted again, moving like clay stop motion. First, it twisted into an expression of terror, with the remaining color drained from his face, jaw wide and eyes too, even his hair disconcerting, standing on end and pointing straight up. Then from there, it morphed into something crying, moaning, and grieving. Scott recognized this pose. The man made a flawless impression of the first time they'd met, the sock and buskin mask. Just as quickly as it had come, it was gone, and now his eyes changed color to emerald green, and a darkness formed around them like smoky eye makeup as he glared at Scott with a flirtatiousness biting his lip, which sent a jolt of sickness through Scott's gut. It was though the man's face were filtering through like pages turning on a jukebox, each with a different purpose. This time his eyebrows became hooked, and the hair on them grew into horned curves, while his eyes, turning the color red and nearly popped out of their socket, exposing more of their shape and pulsing veins. His smile became that of something intending to enjoy its dinner, as with it his teeth sharpened into serrated blades like a shark. "I'm going to drown them again," he screamed, with a voice that revved and roared like an engine. "Drown them again." Scott fell to his knees and covered his face. The sound he made was unlike any he'd made before in his entire life. After some time, which could never be accurately estimated, Scott's panic died down and his yelping turned to a rapid dry wheeze which stung his air pipes. Wiping away the saliva from his face, he trepidatiously pulled himself up onto his feet, still feeling as though the ground could fall out from under him, and then found the courage to check out the windows. He peered left, right, and then, most difficult of all, over his shoulder. There was no one. Nothing. Not even a mark on the ground where the fresh tire tracks should be. No mark or totem made to commemorate the unprecedented evil felt that night, outside of the man who felt it. "Grey skies are gonna clear up. I'm putting on a happy face. The future is bright, and our victory is nigh."
Arnold Duncan hung his arm out the driver's side window, enjoying the freedom of his car's built-in microphone. As he turned on Cherry Elm Avenue, which turns into Shikawa Park, he took the dirt lane instead of the asphalt, where there were a line of cars waiting for entrance to the park. A big cloud of dust plumed into the air and partly got in through the window, which delighted Arnold and gave a whooping holler. "All right, ma, just got here at work. Love you too, check on you tomorrow." As he fumbled with the buttons on the radio to find the one that ended the call, he watched the road as he pulled up next to the security booth, and his eyes caught a glance of Scott. He looked not like himself, and right away the smile on Arnold's face turned to a studying grimace. "Jesus and Mary." Mr. Duncan removed his sunglasses and pulled the cigar from his mouth, perhaps to not obscure his vision with smoke, as he examined the lack of colour in his star employee's face. "You feeling all right, lad?" "I don't really know, sir." He spoke flatly and sickly, and drooped in his chair as if he hadn't slept in days, with hardly the strength to keep his jaw shut. "I'm just at a loss." "Well, Jesus." Mr. Duncan decisively threw the car in park and then pointed an authorial finger right between Scott's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere till you tell me what's ailing you. As your partner, I'm obliged to stay on top of your mental health. This isn't only about you, is it? It's about the team." Scott cleared his raspy voice as if to begin explaining himself, yet his eyes trailed off and he paused before changing the subject. "Hey, Mr. Duncan, it's the 27th of August today, isn't it?" "Yes." The Scotsman raised a bushy eyebrow. "And?" "If I remember correctly, you had a meeting yesterday with the City Planning Commission and the Parks and Rec people. You said there would be lawyers there, something like that?" Mr. Duncan's face went from wide-eyed suspicion to a crinkle-eyed smile. He took the cigar from his mouth and turned it so the seal could be viewed by his friend. "Right there, that little golden otter on my cigar, wearing the cute little crown and scepter? Lontra Dorada, from Brazil." "Oh, okay." Scott nodded his head. "So what?" "It's 120 for one cigar. Just one. And I bought 3 last night. This is the 3rd one." He took a long pull from the cigar and savoured the smoke as it drifted from his mouth. "Gets better every time." "So the meeting was a cigar trade?" "Scott, what if I told you? I think we are in the final stages of working out an agreement with the city planning. What if I told you that yesterday's meeting went so well that my lawyers made all of those bureaucratic wannabe pussy willows look so weak in front of each other that they are going to have no choice but to settle a plan with me before we move to trial? What if I told you that, Scott?" Even through his debilitating exhaustion, Mr. Duncan's star employee brightened with pride and surprise at the news. "If you told me that, sir," he replied, now sitting all the way up, his eyes wide open, "well, I would, I guess I would, take a taste of the Lontra Dorada, The boss teased it in front of Scott until he felt obliged to at least try it. He took it in his hands like a sausage rather than a cigar and pulled on the end for only half a second, smacked his lips, shrugged, then handed it back. "Congratulations, sir." "The Duke, lad, the Duke. In 1 year's time it could be fully constructed. Could you imagine? And I'm telling you, couldn't have done it without you, Scott. You are my man behind the man." Scott shook his head bashfully and peered away, slumping a little more into his exhausted posture. Mr. Duncan noticed the subtle change and got out from his car and stood in front of it, arms folded like a concerned parent, who wasn't going to budge until they made things better. "Now, tell me." He gently put his cigar in a special container to be finished later. "What's got you so pale? Do you not feel well?" The bashfulness turned to guardedness as Scott rubbed his swollen eyes, shook his head, and sighed in frustration. "Mr. Duncan, do I have to?" The boss stomped his foot. "I don't even know where to start. I guess with a question?" "All right, lad. How many people have worked this position?" "Oh, since I've been here, dozens, maybe even 100. I trained most of them. That's why I'm so good with the new blood." "What kind of stories do people tell about the graveyard shift?" "Stories? Asking for stories during that shift is like fishing for diamonds. You sit in a box all night hoping even at least 5 people come through. Stories go, 'Hey, Arnie, I saw a fox. I saw an owl. I saw a drunk lady.'" "What about, anything else? You know, weird stuff." "Ooh, sometimes people do see things." "Is that so?" "Everybody likes to sleep during their shifts. I'm guilty of it too. Sometimes you just can't help it if you're tired. Hell, I get it. It's boring. I've heard people tell me they start dreaming or downright hallucinating during a long shift." "Really?" Scott asked hopefully. "But did they know they were dreaming? Or what kind of things?" "Yeah, sure, I remember a couple of stories. Just my favourites. Someone told me he dreamt he was greeted by 2 kung fu masters on motorcycles throwing rotten apples at him, and he had to hide in the booth to avoid getting hit. Then a 3rd kung fu guy appeared inside the booth. Sam woke up screaming. Another guy said he was a moth and flew into the light bulb, and when he woke up he still felt burnt. How about you? You got one?" "What about not funny dreams? Was anyone ever unsure if they had dreamed something or not dreamed something?" "No." Mr. Duncan frowned with concern. "Never. Of course they knew it was a dream." "That's the thing," Scott said, pinching with fingers to show emphasis. "I don't know what's going on with me. Last night, I saw a man here. I saw him. He pulled up. There he was, and... Scott's eyes grew wide as he got stuck on his word, just holding his mouth aghast in thought. "Lad?" the boss prodded. "Everything about it was wrong," Scott went on. "When I think back on the encounter and start to describe it and say it out loud, I can't. It was too fantastical. I know it had to have been a dream. There's no other explanation." Scott threw his hands up. "Why don't you tell me what happened in the dream anyway? We'll hear how silly it sounds together." The man in the car, everything about him was wrong. Uncanny. He moved his face in such an unnatural way. It was like he had no muscles beneath his skin. But it was just so damn malevolent. Malevolent. So much so, it caught me off guard again. All throughout, his car was so quiet, but I thought I heard something in the distance, like a broken engine down by the river. "What, Scotty?" Mr. Duncan was getting a little lost in all of Scott's diatribes. "Look, if it was only a bad dream, then I still need to get my head looked at because I am not okay with that." Now Scott sounded worked up, and Mr. Duncan put his hands out as if to temper the coming storm. That's all right. "It's not all right, damn. Saying this out loud makes me sound crazy." Mr. Duncan had never heard Scott curse. Even such a feeble little curse as damn struck his ear the wrong way. "Scott, it was just a nightmare. I want you to believe it. Whatever happened, it sounds like it couldn't have been anything else." "That's for sure." "Scotty, I think I know what happened. I didn't want to say anything, but I had an idea early on, since you mentioned the date." He shook his head, like a confident father would before bestowing age-old wisdom. "You told me you are very sensitive to morbidity. 1 year ago, you remember that?" "Yes." "I said to you, when you wouldn't let that guy in the convertible through the gate, remember? I said, not everyone is like that psycho back in 98.
Yeah, Scott said, waving away the words. I remember. Well, let me guess. Curiosity got the cat? What did you do, go home and Google it? Well, you're so weird, maybe you went to the library and read about it in an old newspaper article. I haven't been to a library since I was 11. I remember it well. Scott, you don't have to lie to me. I'm sure someone has told you about the drownings. They're famous. Scott looked away as Arnold went on. There was a man who drove onto the premises some 20 years back. But the thing is, he had his kids in the trunk of the car. And his wife, too, Arnold said. And Scott puckered his face uncomfortably. I think maybe if you hear it, you'll stop having bad dreams about it. A man killed his family here? Not here. Down there. Mr. Duncan fingered towards the bridge. Scott winced again. Jesus, I feel like I've just sold the murder house to a newly married couple. Look, full disclosure, and the story is simple. Waylon Wilf, mid-40s, lived just 30 minutes north from here. Showed up one night drunk. He was always drunk, but this time really bad. He came up right where I'm standing here around 3 a.m. He talks a little blah blah blah, and the lad goes on his way. There was no disturbance that night, no trouble, except he doesn't come back in the morning. No big deal. But a week passes. Now he's missing. And it just so happens that his family's staying at the timeshare. Well, no one's seen them neither. Scott made a sound like he was feeling sick. Yeah, so the department starts fishing around, aren't finding much, till they decide to literally start fishing around. As in the Shokewa, just off the bridge, right there. Why did he do it? Scott said as he tried his best to hide the tear welling up in his left eye. Hell, that's a question for Ted Bundy, not me. Who knows why anyone does this crap? Maybe she was leaving him, or that was his way of leaving her. Guy was a friggin' psycho either way. Some people thought he had like a bomb in the car, or immolation device. Like he was a mad scientist on top of everything. Immolation device? Scott shook his head. Why would they think that? It's 'cause even though they searched the river 10 times over, they never found any evidence. Never found the car, and never found the bodies. I personally don't know how that is even possible, since they were underwater anyway. Can't set fire to your car underwater, right? But somehow he did it, supposedly. He had a bomb in the car? I'm seeing some investigators think he did. I guess some people find it eerie that they vanished into pure air, or pure water. Some people had theories that maybe it got washed downstream somehow, but they're stupid. That's not physically possible. Hell, the simple answer? Incompetent detectives. I bet you if they just gave it one more look, they'd find it. Then why did anyone think he drove them off the bridge? Huh? A missing family is a missing family. Who saw them drive off the bridge and make that claim? Scotty, what? Obviously there was someone in the booth that night, and they had to testify. And who was on duty? Well, you know, it was me, Scotty. I didn't see it go down, but I certainly heard it. Kinda put 2 and 2 together eventually. Scott twisted up his face like a branding iron seared his cheek. It made him look instantly obscene, and it drew away Arnold's warm gaze. Oh, Scott, I didn't mean to disappoint you, he went on awkwardly. But this is why I don't tell people this stuff. I mean, I knew Waylon Wilf personally. He and his family had come by before. For all I knew, they were good people. Oh yeah? Scott said. For all you knew? Yes. Mr. Duncan looked Scott in the eye again. I can hear the judgment in your voice. Tell me how I could have prevented what happened, Scott, without knowing first what would happen. It's not in our job description to search each visitor for wives and kids tied up in the trunk. We don't have a stop and frisk license. Yet, what's not fair is I'm still left with the guilt of knowing I was the last person who saw him. Maybe I could have helped him, but at a certain point, I have to accept that there's nothing I could have done. Nothing? Nothing. Did he pass inspection? Scott asked.
Mr. Duncan coughed and then peered down at his fingernails, which rubbed together like cricket's legs. Yes. Are you sure? Because… Yes, Scotty. The angry tomato threw his fists in the air. You don't need to put me on trial. I put myself on trial. But no matter what I say, you're going to scrutinize, because that's what you do, isn't it? Why can't things ever be simple with you, lad? You make your own life so goddamn complicated, then everyone else's life is complicated too. That's your problem. Scott stood silent and stared into the side of the fuming Mr. Duncan, who chuckled as he pulled out and relit his cigar. I can't believe this. You crack me up. You really crack me up. I think I'm seeing a different side to you today, Scott said. Hey, Duncan barked. I think you need to go home and rest, so open the damn gate so I can get done and we can switch places. Mr. Duncan twisted around and got back in his car, slamming the door shut. Scott put his hand on the switch to open the gate, but before twisting the knob, he leaned forward and asked one last question. Mr. Duncan, if you don't mind, I'd like to know what kind of car he was driving. Who? Scott spoke dryly. Waylon Wilf. Night of the murders. The car he drove. I don't know. It's been years and years. If I said he drove a black Audi Quattro, would that sound about right to you? Huh? He peered up into his memory and scratched his head. Yeah, that's it. That was the exact car. How did you? He smiled wryly and wiggled a finger towards the security booth. So, did you look it up after all? That's why you're having nightmares. Why didn't you just admit it from the start? Actually, Arnie, Scott turned the knob, beginning the brass iron gate slow and unsturdy unfastening. I never read that sort of junk. Yeah, if you say so. Mr. Duncan threw his car into drive and without another word accelerated past the gate and across the bridge. He rubbed his brow tensely and watched the security booth shrink away in his rearview window, all the while muttering curse words and self-flagellations. Scott, on the other hand, stood completely still, staring into the space his boss had occupied without moving hardly a muscle, until the next visitor arrived nearly 10 minutes later, a father with his 3 children loaded up into a camper van. They failed to pass inspection. According to the handbook, every visitor should be supplying 1 tent for every 3 visitors, but the father of 3 had brought 1 tent. The father assured Scott there was room enough to sleep comfortably in the car and they'd planned on it. Scott shook his head, and after nearly 20 minutes of arguing, the jolly man had become furious. He threw his hands up and turned around as his children cried in the back seat. Scott watched them go, and when he was sure they wouldn't be coming back, he slumped into his chair and opened a magazine. Looking back on that day, August 27th, 2009, could be marked as the beginning of the end. Scott's personality had begun to morph or degrade from there on out, and it reminded Arnold Duncan of a story he saw on TV a long time ago, about a man having a railroad spike shot through his eye and back of his head. He somehow survived the traumatic injury, but lost a piece of himself in it, as close friends of the man could attest. His buoyancy evaporated while a love of gambling grew, and a dull, passive-aggressive man emerged from the affable personality they once knew. It was as though, Arnold observed, that he had thrown a train spike through Scott's eye that day. His star pupil reverted back to being the problem child, worse than ever. He was getting calls almost daily, and more calls and paperwork were sure to follow. Although Scott was technically following the rules, Arnie knew it was all on purpose. He was doing it to spite him. In a way, he could understand that, and even tolerate it, because, for some reason, he really liked Scott. As long as the only thing he was hurting was Arnold's patience. One day, in mid-October, he was awoken with a phone call. It was still 5 a.m, and he had a difficult time falling asleep the night prior. The voice on the line was panicked, even angry, and kept using the word emergency, emergency. Without fully thinking, Duncan threw on his pants and ran to start up his car. He drove the hour to Shikawa, blaring the radio all the way to keep from falling asleep. When he finally arrived, he found Scott standing in the morning twilight, surrounded by a group of college-aged friends, stamping their feet and grinding their teeth.
"What's going on, Scott?"
Mr. Duncan asked, hitching up his pants and still wiping the crust from his eyes. "Good you're here," Scott said, before turning to address the kids. "Listen, this is my boss, Arnold Duncan. Now, he's going to tell you all to pack up your things and leave. If you ignore him the way you ignored me, then the police will get involved next."
"Scott," Duncan repeated, "would you tell me what's going on? I have the right to know before I go threatening anyone, don't I?"
"I'll tell you what's going on," the boy in flip-flop said. "This is all over an orange. One lousy, stupid orange." The boy pulled it from his fanny pack, a large, ripe orange, and chucked it behind him straight into the river. "Hey!" Scott yelled out in a burst of fury.
"Hold on now,"
Duncan got between Scott and the boy.
"What's so bad about an orange?"
"Yeah, that's what I want to know." The boy crossed his arms. "That's the problem, sir. They already came in. I asked him during their check-in if they were carrying anything that was potentially harmful to the natural fauna and flora of the conservatory, and they told me right to my face, no. Then I drove into the park to use the bathroom, and what do I see? All of these kids binging on a sack of oranges and throwing the peels and seeds all over the ground." "It's fruit. It's not littering," one of the girls shouted. "You're right. It's actually worse. Oranges and other citrus fruits are actually harborers for a whole list of parasites, like fruit fly larvae, which can be harmful to our ecosystem." Scott waggled a finger at the kids. "So, on top of everything, you've been eating bugs this whole time." "There's no bugs in my oranges, man."
"Scott, what are you talking about?"
Duncan put a hand on his employee's shoulder.
"There's no rule against bringing oranges onto the grounds."
"There's a rule against bringing potentially harmful substances."
"And oranges are on that list?"
"You can't even bring oranges into the state of California without a license."
"I repeat, are oranges on our list?"
"Well, they should be," Scott yelled. Arnold opened his mouth to respond, but instead laughed and shook his head.
"They should be."
Arnold clapped his hands.
"Oh, wow. What else should be?"
"Hey, what's the deal?" One of the other kids, with curly, dirty blonde hair, stepped forward. "Are we leaving or are we going? 'Cause I got some place we're supposed to be right now."
"Yes, sir." Mr. Duncan waved at them. "You're free to return to the park. I apologize."
Then his eyes went wide with realization.
"Oh, my God."
"What is it?" Scott asked, but Mr. Duncan had no time to answer. He sprang back in his car and bulleted towards the road. He was speeding, weaving through traffic, and parked so haphazardly on his driveway he ran over some of his lawn. He sprinted to his bedroom, throwing his clothes off before he was even inside the door, and changed into a suit jacket, tie, and dress shoes as fast as he could. He shot out of the house, still barreling down the road, but by this time the reality had set in, and although he kept driving, he was prepared for the worst. The hearing time was at 8 o'clock sharp. Mr. Duncan didn't arrive until 9:12. The first time he was given the chance to speak his mind in front of a judge and finally make them understand he was the far lesser evil next to the idiots at Parks and Rec, he fumbled. He didn't show up and left the judge to make the assumption that Arnold Duncan is an unfocused, unorganized, and possibly angry man who attacked the planning board because he didn't get his way, then has no commitment to what he started. To Arnold's case and the future of the Duke, it was a major blow. Scott was at home pouring a bowl of Fiber Crunch cereal. He picked up the phone and casually slurped from the spoon as he received the news from his boss that if things didn't change within the next couple of weeks, he'd have to be let go. He said he understood, and he was sorry for the trouble. All in all, the call went smoothly. Maybe too smoothly. 2 days later, Arnold received a phone call letting him know that there would be no Scott at work today, or any day. They wished each other well, but as Arnold hung up the phone, he couldn't help but hang his head too. What a waste. Part 5. At John Almond Catholic Academy, springtime was special. Other schools held fundraising in November. John Almond did theirs in March. They held an annual bake sale in April and May, not October, which was downright notorious. Kids looked so forward to the springtime bake sale that a raffle was held in February for an early box of brownies and cookies, with proceeds going to charity. Most students held warm memories of the Easter Day functions, even warmer than Christmas, what with its dreaded mandatory mass and caroling expeditions to retirement homes and corporate dinner events. Easter had candy-filled eggs hidden all across the school, personalized baskets for every student and faculty, and a short play which only had one presentation on Easter Day. Easy. In the pungent air, surrounded by color and life, there were balls to kick and friends to make, bugs to catch and flowers to smell, and every day the promise of summer grew louder, and how could anything be sweeter than that? But for Scott Foley, there really was one thing which interested him about the springtime semester of each calendar year: the chance to become the youngest hall monitor in John Almond history. Although students were not eligible for candidacy until the age of 12, he pushed his advocacy onto the Parent-Teacher Council and fellow students for 5 years in a row. The faculty had managed the crisis of Scott's impassioned self-promotions, but with each year the situation grew worse. At 7 years old, Scott's chiding seemed adorable. At 10, it was unpleasant, and worst of all, time-consuming. It seemed like it was almost every day Scott was trying to squeeze his way into a faculty lounge and speak with someone about an infraction he'd witnessed and make sure they had to deal with it. In the year of our Lord, 1973, Scott was 11, still too young for eligibility, but a year prior, Father Ryan had already made a decision concerning next year's hall monitor. Without even holding a vote, he declared that Scott would be the winner. He even spent money on a sash and bestowed it upon him in a mock knighting ceremony. For Scott, it was the greatest honor he'd ever received and was a triumph of vindication. Likewise, for the faculty, it was victory by preoccupation. If Scott Foley was busy being hall monitor, he'd spend all his time bothering the kids instead of them, and for the most part, it worked pretty well. Their philosophy at the time? Scott was never as much of a nuisance as when he didn't have something to enforce. Another famous bit of springtime tradition came in the annual Science Sleepover, an optional event which awarded no extra credit, because if you were there, you didn't need it. In 1972, during an odd cold snap near the end of May, the sleepover had become a true hardship. The untimely frozen weather made several activities entirely impossible, especially those taking place outside, like stargazing or mini hot air balloons. Likewise, anything containing water balloons were out, as that seemed to be begging for someone to catch pneumonia. The sleepover was an event certain kids looked forward to practically the minute they enrolled in John Almond, and here was an entire class of girls and boys getting passed over by the weather. It wasn't right, but it wasn't all bad either. Sister Mary Culvert was leading an activity which was still salvageable, except until they discovered at the last minute that they'd run out of food dye necessary to complete the experiment. She came to the kitchen and asked if the men working there could find any green and blue food dye for her, but after 10 minutes they told her there was none. But one man had found 2 cases of 20-ounce glass bottles filled with carbonated apple cider, presumably left over from Christmas. When they were shown to the instructors, the thought came to simply hand over the bottles to the kids and let them drink till their heart's content. Something so simple like this can be very exciting to children, and indeed the sleeping bag-strewn auditorium erupted in cheers as the bottles were being handed out. Scott was there. He drank his entire bottle in less than 10 minutes, and after finishing it and placing the bottle in the new recycling bin, he approached Sister Culvert and asked if he could have another. She laughed and responded by saying, "My, you might feel like J.D. Rockefeller on New Year's Eve."
New Year's Eve? Scott asked. Yes, you know, because of all the bubbly and the... No, Scott said quickly. Maybe if I had my own bottle of soda, it would feel like New Year's. Sister Culvert made a disdainful face, but another instructor, Sister Brown, overheard Scott's comment, and she had a different reaction. In for a penny, in for a pound, she thought. A little while later she re-entered the sleepover, holding bags of sugary snacks and cans of soda to be handed out liberally, causing even louder cheers than before. The kids played board games, sang songs, and ran around the auditorium until it was time to sleep, at which point the boys and girls were separated into different rooms, and the whole pack of them crashed into their sleep bags without hesitation and had long, restful sleep all through the night. All except for Scott. He did sleep some, but he'd woken up 3 times in the night, all by the same dream. In his lucid hallucinations, he climbed out of his sleeping bag, marched down the hall to the little boy's room, and relieved himself in an open stall. But at the moment he relaxed his bladder, and the moment of relief would come, something in his body shook him awake, and he stopped himself from wetting his pajamas. The first 2 times he was able to fall back asleep, assuring himself he'd wake in the morning. Third time, he could not even keep his eyes shut. After tossing and turning for 30 minutes, he decided if he didn't empty his bladder soon, it would probably end up killing him. After taking about 6 preparatory heaves of air, he threw the thick, warm sleeping bag off his chest and hopped to his feet in a way that reminded him of Spider-Man, and cringed as he quickly stood up and embraced the chilly night air. He pulled the long sleeves of his dinosaur-pattern PJs so that his arms could go inside his shirt and wrap around the bare skin of his bony ribcage. He walked slowly at first, not trying to wake up his friends. But as he got further away from his circle of influence, he began to move faster and occasionally bump a head or 2. Finally, on the other side of the sea of bodies, he scuttled to the west side double doors and pushed his shoulder against the crash bar and slipped into the hallway. Sister Culvert had told the boys before turning off the lights that if anyone had to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, the hallway lights would still be on. She didn't mean to lie, but a janitor turned the lights off sometime around midnight through an act of pure muscle memory, and by that time, all the children and their chaperones were asleep. Scott took one look down that dark, empty hallway and decided that maybe he would just pee his pants instead. He turned back around and pulled on the knob to re-enter the auditorium and quickly get back under his warm covers, but he found it was locked. His eyes bulged, and his other hand instinctively went to the knob and began pulling hard, as if to rip the thing off. He almost called out for someone to let him back in, but stopped himself, then let his hands off the doorknob. He wouldn't disrupt his peers' sleep because he wasn't willing to simply walk around to the south side door, which he knew was open, because he watched Sister Chapernale put a wooden block in the doorway 2 hours ago. To do anything else would be an act of vanity, he told himself. Only vain people break the rules. Scott slipped his hands back through the sleeves of his shirt, no longer feeling the cold, and began to march down the hallway at a trotting pace. He came to the first right and slowed down, bent his head down the corner, and startled himself. He gasped and jumped and put his hand over his mouth, but in fact there was nothing there. He hadn't even thought he'd seen something, but his anticipation had made him jumpy. He laughed and finally calmed down a bit, but it didn't slow his pace of walking at all. The doors to the library on this side were large wood-carved double doors, engraved with flowers and English braids, and made practically no sound as Scott glided the left door open, 12 feet tall, and left it open, just in case it too was locked. The library itself was less impressive than its doors, only being 1 story and having only 2 bookshelves for each genre. There was a popular reading area decorated with cardboard, ocean creatures, and bean bags, but the selection on hand was actually wanting, even when compared to the public schools in the same district. Somehow, seeing it like this, vacant and dark and without the excitement of classmates, he realized how few books there really were, and how lazy their grouping had been designed.
Scott peered his head down each alley of books, lamenting on each one as he passed by.
Fiction? How is that a genre? They've just grouped all their novels into one section and called it a day. That is very sad. Science? What's funny about the science section is that it includes magazines about cars and home remodeling. World? World. That's not a thing. I mean, I've seen books in there on ancient Egypt, Abraham Lincoln, and African ecosystems. But when you've got upwards of 10 books about Jesus in Israel, maybe just give it its own section. Children's stories? I remember I checked out an already used coloring book here once.
Scott stopped walking and stopped thinking. His right foot hung in front of him with his heel pointed, and then slowly played itself in reverse. Scott walked back into the world section and took another look down the shadowy, double-sided alleyway of books.
"Hey," he said, with furrowing brow and bulging eyes. "Who are you?"
The little blonde boy, standing all by himself, didn't respond. He held a book in one hand, not at its spine but on its side, letting it splay open, almost touching the ground. His other hand was in his mouth, being sucked on like a pacifier as he swayed back and forth in at his hips in a constant rhythm. He wore baggy overalls on top of a red and white striped onesie, and on his head was a strange hat Scott could only relate as being something Donald Duck might wear.
"Hey,"
Scott said again, this time with less abrupt anger.
"I'm the head hall monitor, elected and picked by Father Ryan himself, entrusted with the power to enact the rules and guidelines of campus-wide hallway passage conduct. If you're not either on your way to or coming back from the bathroom, then you need to return to the auditorium, the room with all the big kids, okay?"
The little blonde boy in the funny hat looked up from his book, which he finally let fall from his grasp onto the floor. He regarded Scott with his wide blue eyes, and for a moment he thought the child might cry.
"Come on,"
Scott said, reaching out his hand toward the little boy.
"I can take you back there."
But the boy didn't cry. Instead, he looked away from Scott back towards the bookshelf and walked. Scott couldn't say if he walked behind it or into it. He just walked.
"Where did you go?"
He looked into the next section over, but the little kid wasn't there. Scott's eyebrows screwed up, and he could feel tingles all going through his face. He checked the next section, then the next section, hoping to maybe catch up with the kid. But he was gone. Like he was never even there to begin with. With his hands on his hips, he inquisitively walked up to the edge of the bookshelf where he saw the boy walk away. The book on the ground, the one he'd been reading, was on trains. Scott felt the place where the wall met the side of the shelf and found it was pressed all the way against it. No room for even air to fit through. Scott did nothing at first, simply processed the information. Then he noticed the quiet and the darkness and how alone he was. The sound that came out of Scott next was like a hog cry and a mule whine at the same time. He kicked himself off the wall and dashed at full sprint out of the world section and on a dime turned toward the big wooden doors, praying they had not somehow shut and locked without him knowing. He practically leapt through the crack between the library doors, and now, heaving air at twice per second, he ran wildly down the hallway and finally crashed against the locked auditorium door. His limbs flew against the rattling doors, wildly kicking, pounding, screaming. He also finally took care of his bladder problem.
"St. Dominic, this is my Keisha Gibbs," the receptionist said into the pink telephone. How can I assist you tonight?
She listened and nodded her head along with the voice in her ear as she delicately arranged a group of thick-cut potato fries at the ends of her stick on nails to be dipped in a pool of mayonnaise and hot sauce, prepared for her by the cafeteria staff just before closing up for the night.
Yes, sir, I understand. In fact, that individual does reside with us.
Mykesha wiped the sides of her mouth with a napkin from her purse.
But I'm afraid it's very late, you know. Most of our residents here are asleep well before 10 o'clock, and it's already been past midnight. Why don't you call back tomorrow, around noon, just before we do luncheon?
The receptionist nodded her head and listened to the phone as another orderly passed by, wheeling a sleeping woman up to her room. She waved and blew a kiss, and the orderly mouthed the words, "Love you, babe."
Is that so now?
The receptionist listened to the man's explanation.
Well, I suppose she really don't be getting too many callers. Listen, sir, I'm gonna patch you through to her room, but if she don't pick up, don't call back, please. Just try another time. You have a nice night as well, sir. And if you reach her, tell her I say good evening.
Danica Shacourt laid awake in her room due to the storm. The Florida Keys were beautiful, just as they were said to be, but the near-unending barrage of weather was making constant intrusion. All the same, her money had been spent. She had no choice but to live with her decision. The wind blew open windows and sometimes broke the glass. The rain came in sideways and pelted the building so hard, Danica would sometimes dream that she was being pelted with frogs. The plentiful trees were always rattling their leaves, while thunder and lightning came on by the hour. Tonight was very bad, and the 90-year-old Sister Shacourt lied on her back in her expensive mattress with her hands folded across thinning breasts and watched the light from the windows clash across the ceiling, like a small display of fireworks just above her head. Every time the thunder cracked, it jolted her nerves uncomfortably and made her even more irritable. Then, the phone rang. At the second ring, she looked behind her at the clock on the other bedstand and read that it was indeed almost 1 in the morning. During the third ring, she huffed and placed her hand on her hip before reaching for the receiver and turning on the desk light. "Yes? Hello?" she said sharply and without her teeth in. "Is there a reason you need to be calling this late?" "Hello?" the voice on the line said. "I'm sorry. Have I woken you?" It was a man, speaking under his breath. He sounded unsure of himself. No, you didn't wake me." Danica scooched her back up on the banister and put on her glasses. "I told the orderlies I stopped taking my nighttime medications. Did you not get the memo?" "What?" the man on the line said. "My doctor already took me off the nighttime—" "I do not work at where you live," the man interrupted stiffly. "I'm calling you from a different state entirely." "Oh," Danica replied, taken aback. "Then this must be a call about some bad news." She clutched at her quilt. "No use in saving me the tender touch. I'd prefer you just rip the Band-Aid off and tell me. Who is it?" "Who? Yes, I'm asking who died." "No one," the man interrupted awkwardly again. "I'm not a doctor or police. I'm just a person paying you a call. I wanted to say hello because I was a student of yours once, from John Hammond." "John Hammond?" Danica said, a little befuddled, and then intrigued. "It's funny. I could almost have guessed that a moment ago." She trailed off, giving the phone in her hand the side eye.
"Judd Bradley."
The man exuberantly ended the awkward silence.
"It's me, Judd Bradley, from the class of '80, with Maggie Kreppheimer and Douglas Gideon, and I could go on. Do you remember that year?"
"You're Judd Bradley?" Danica asked, again giving the phone in her hand a skeptical look.
"Yes,"
the man said, a little insulted.
"Is there something wrong?"
No, it's just..." The sister took a deep breath and tried to start over. "It is nice to hear from you, Judd. Yes, of course I remember you. You were the tall blonde boy, always had a soccer ball under your arm. You made things with toothpaste for the science fairs, and you were friends with that little red-haired girl."
"Little red-haired girl?"
"Yes, the little Patricia Bishop Shepherd," he cut in. That sounds right.
I remember you, I remember her, and I remember that class. It was very memorable. It makes me very glad to hear you say that, Sister Shakecourt. It really means so much to know you still kept me in your memory after all these years. Oh, thank you, I suppose. I mean to say, bless your heart. She felt a little awkward. She didn't normally say things like, bless your heart, but was at a loss. I'm into real estate now, Judd went on. I have a wife named Victoria and 2 daughters named June and Shauna. I didn't end up moving very far. I'm still in New Jersey, but I do all right for myself, and I have a nice home, and I seem to go on vacations probably about twice a year. Check me out on MySpace. It's all on there, if you want to verify. Don't bother trying to contact me, because I never even look at my messages. Sorry. Verify? She looked at the phone cross again. That's okay, Judd. I don't really use the computer. But all the same, that sounds very nice. It's good to know that you made out all right. You must have a very lovely family. They are very lovely, yes. I wish they could meet you. Oh my, how nice of you to say. A rip of crackling lightning startled Danica and stole her attention as she watched through the window. Sister, he vocalized, how are you doing? Well, I hope. What? She squawked. I'm sorry, it's very noisy here because of the storm. Come again? I said, you're doing well as well? Oh, yes, I'm fine. It's all fine, thank you. I'm really, really happy to hear that, sister. Yeah. Danica looked down again and began fiddling with the ends of her nightgown sleeves. The man coughed, hacked something up and apologized. Danica said, No, it's fine. And then nothing. Danica sighed and broke the standstill. It has been very pleasant talking to you, Judd. You're a good boy to think of me in my old age. I'd appreciate it very much if you called again sometime, but please in the afternoon. Good night. Sister Shakecourt, there's something I have been thinking about a lot lately. Uh-huh. She pulled the phone back up to her ear. Do you remember how some students were afraid of John Ammons being haunted? Sure. She shook her wrist. But that's what children do. They make up fantasies. Children think their own rooms are haunted. So, all you people in the teacher's lounge, you never had your own stories, your own beliefs? Of course not. Listen, when I was a little girl, my sisters and I all believed in a monster that lived in the cornfields around the farm. We were absolutely terrified of going out there in the stalks after the sun had gone down. I remember staying up late, my sisters and I describing the monster to each other as if we'd all seen the same thing. Really, we were making it up as we went along. When we got older into our teenage years, we'd egg each other to walk through the fields, to prove we weren't chicken. Prove that we weren't still babies. Me, I was terrified. Well into 13, but I had to prove I wasn't. And in proving it, I realized something very important. Only awful thing out in those corn stalks were the goddamn coyotes after all. Wow, you know, I never would have guessed I'd one day hear a sister curse. I'd say I've earned it. So, were there people you knew that acted superstitious? At John Ammond, I mean. No, I can't say there was. We were a very level-headed bunch. But were there ever any rumors? Did you ever work with someone who was just a little off? Was there anything someone said they couldn't explain? Oh my, I don't know. She trailed off and came back again. But, now that you mention it, there was once a time when things got a little bit abstract. Really? Judd said, sounding very interested. And it was during your tenure. You don't say. Did you ever hear the name Sebastian Hugo Sterling? Is that some kind of law firm? No, it's actually the name of a very historied John Almond alum. Technically, his name was Sebastian Hugo Sterling Jr. III. Quite a mouthful, aye? He sounds prestigious. With a name like that, he should be mayor. Had he lived, he probably would have been. Most of his family line were in politics anyway. He died at a very, very young age. Most were still calling him Baby Sebastian at the time of his death.
though he was not a baby, more of a late toddler. Maybe 5 years old? About. He was a student at John Ammond in its very earliest days, when it was still being assembled. I remember when I was a girl, after coming from Ireland, all the veteran nuns telling us about how much construction they'd seen. Lord, any time I met with the older women, they'd say, "I remember a time when your shoes would be in the mud had you been standing at that spot." Sometimes I doubted their memory, because it could seem the whole school used to be mud, but nevertheless, they spoke of the old days aplenty. We heard all kinds of stories about the old lang syne. You track down anyone of my John Ammond generation, and I bet they could still repeat a few of the stories about the gay old times, wherever they are. What about you? Can you still repeat one or two? Stories? Sister Shakecourt rolled her eyes. From the gay old times? Well, criminy, ain't I doing that right now? I'm sorry, sister. Anyway, baby Sebastian. One of the sadder stories, I'd say. The vanishing of baby Sebastian. It was the late 1910s, during some of the school's most fundamental architectural construction. The children were looked after in the creche, but one day Sebastian managed to wander off before anyone knew what was happening. At the time it was extremely tragic, you know. His family was very influential. The Hugo Sterlings used their power in politics to inflict a harsher sentence on those poor women than what they deserved. The Hugo Sterlings had them killed? No, of course not. The 3 women all served a year in jail, which was still a worse fate than any of them deserved. If you ask me, that family always taught their children to do whatever they want. The problem came from how the boy was being raised, just like how they are today. So, Sebastian snuck away, went off on his own to explore the school, and he was kidnapped by someone. Then his family punished a few sisters, but the kid was never found. I never said he was kidnapped. Many people did think that. The truth turned out to be a little less Hessian, but strange all the same. Because it's now known, after all those countless years speculating on poor baby Sebastian, that factually, he fell to his death during the construction of the John Ammond Library. He wandered in there and somehow wound up on the upper ledge, where there was no railing at the time. He fell from 11 feet, died, and his body tumbled into a cavity of the uncompleted wall. So, wedged into that space between 2 walls, his body lay hidden, and as the construction unknowingly went on, and they sealed him up in the dark. When did this come out? Like I said, during your tenure, 1972. I could never forget it. You would have been 10 or 11. But how? I'd assume you were born in 60. No, I mean, how did it take so long to discover the truth? Sister Shakecourt croaked and then clicked her tongue in disappointment. I thought it was very upsetting at the time. It affected me worse than everyone else. Can't convince me not of that. All the others, they thought it was very strange, but I said no, this is an obscenity. How did they find the body? It just leaned against the wall one day. I don't mean to sound glib, though. In the basement, with the water heater and furnace, the janitors went down after school to get ready for the clean. They couldn't help but notice the wood panel walls looking strange. In this one spot, it looked obtuse. The wall was slightly convexed. The janitor's first thought, maybe watering leak warping the wood. So he went back upstairs to fetch Father Ryan, who came down and pressed on the wall himself and said, "There's something in there. It is not water." One of the janitors got out and told someone else, and then it spread like wildfire. School was out, the kids were mostly gone, so more than half the faculty found their way into that furnace room staring at the wall. I was there too, arguing with everyone else. They said Father Ryan should take an axe to the wall and see what's in there. But I said no, let's call the fire station and wait for their appraisal. Didn't matter. They had a very good point. Something in that wall whose life is in danger unless we saved it. So they chopped away at it and what?
and baby Sebastian was finally free. They could tell pretty much right away. Wasn't much there could be saved. Baby Sebastian's body, after all those years. So maybe an earthquake or a shifting of the building's inner structure moved the skeleton and it fell, or it somehow changed position and started pressing. Here's the thing, and if you find this disturbing, remember, son, you did ask. When the coroner and scene investigators finished their appraisal, they agreed that the body had not changed its position for decades. They estimated, most likely, he hadn't moved since he died. Yet, all those years, almost 70 years, no one once ever noticed the way those panels stuck out. We saw those panels every day. It still gives me a certain feeling every time I think of it. Officially, the body had been there for 60 years. That's what it says on the official coroner's report. But the intramural feeling, very different. We saw those walls every day. Every day. Thank you, the voice on the line said. That is very interesting. Isn't it, though? The thunder cracked again and gave her another annoying startle. Are you all right? Did you fall down? It's just the storm, she grumbled. Thank you, sweetheart, and reached toward her bedstand to take a sip of water. What made you ask all that, I wonder? I didn't ask about baby Sebastian. You brought him up. I know. You asked if I knew anything strange about John Ammons. I think I did a pretty good job answering your question, so why don't you answer mine, sweetheart? Why are you so curious about John Ammond? Because, the voice on the line paused before starting again. I live by a very simple lesson. You hear good stories when you ask good questions. That's an old standby for me. Oh, I see, Shakecourt replied. You just were so persistent because you wanted to hear a story. Was I very persistent? He laughed. Well, maybe because I remember you being such a good storyteller. Thank you, Sister Shakecourt. I really hope you're able to get some sleep tonight. Good night. There is a little more to that story, you know, she replied. You should want to hear it, if you love a good story. Aren't you tempted to hear it? Tempted? He said. Shakecourt didn't reply, and the man continued. I really don't want to keep you awake. Not a problem at all. This little extra detail, it concerns a classmate of yours who also graduated year of 1980. Oh, the voice said, almost uninterested. He was the hall monitor at the time, youngest hall monitor to ever be made at John Ammond. You know who I'm talking about, you must. I'm actually very tired myself, sister. Scott Foley. Come on now, son. Judd, you can't tell me you don't remember Scott Foley. Judd? Shame on you, Judd. It's not that I don't remember him, he sighed. I'm just more of a face person. Uh-huh, Sister Shakecourt huffed. Well, this name should supersede all of that. This name you should remember. This name you should have seared into the side of your head like a cattle brand heated at 1,000,000 degrees. This name should be etched across your tombstone, and mine. All right, the voice said. Yes, Scott Foley, okay, I remember him. I didn't think he was that awful, though. Well, he sure was something. If I remember correctly, you and I certainly had a few discussions about. We did? Judd said, sounding offended. How could we not? I was 11 years old. What's your excuse? I don't need one. It was Scott Foley, for God's sake. Everyone talked about him. They did? Of course they did. You were there. When he was in first grade, Sister Teresa warned us. There's a grenade coming down the line. Each consecutive year after that, the poor women tasked with teaching Scott would again reiterate for the next generation. They'd say, brace yourself for this one. They would? Yes, Shakecourt howled. The boy was an utter folk legend. Everyone knew him. Everyone had a story. No one particularly understood him. But the worst part was, he didn't even understand himself. Judd, are you still on the line? So, what's the point? Danica waved her hand. Like I said before, baby Sebastian was raised without the concept of accountability.
Scott was the first person to right that wrong, even if it came a little too late. What? In 72, we had a science fair at John Hammond. I'm sure you were there, Judd, whether you remember or not, but I wasn't. I heard this from the ladies on duty, and according to them, little Scott Foley got up in the middle of the night and marched down the hall to the little boys' room, only he didn't make it all the way there. He came running and screaming back. His pants were soaked because he couldn't hold it any longer, and he was crying in hysterics. I sort of wish I was there that day, for that reason alone, but I digress. That was common knowledge instantly. But what wasn't well known until a year of gossip had come and gone was that little Scott Foley claimed that he had seen a young boy with blonde hair in the library that night. But remember, Scott was the hall monitor. He told that little boy, "You can't be here any longer," and I bet he told him good. After that, according to Scott, the little boy vanished, as in thin air. The science fair of 72 was one day, I repeat, one day before we found Sebastian's body. We went almost 100 years without ever seeing that watermelon lump in the damn wall, excuse my language, but the moment Scott told off some mystery boy in the middle of the night in the exact spot where baby Sebastian fell, abracadabra, abracadabra, the voice on the line trailed off. Yes, the sister yawned. Well, I hope you liked the story. Sister, he sounded suddenly alert. I want to thank you for letting me call you so late. It's not a problem. And I want to thank you for answering all my questions with vivid recollection. Of course. And I want to thank you for dealing with me, even though I was such a problem child. Oh, Shacourt said softly. And because sometimes I think about those old times when I had lots of people in my life, even though I didn't ask for it. And now, when you get older, you have so much less when you really need it. And maybe, if it's not taking up too much of your time, I could call you again, and maybe we could have tea over the phone. Danica paused. Then an unstoppable grin stretched across her face. She felt warm, and when the lightning struck this time, she barely reacted at all. It wouldn't be taking up any of my time. In fact, I'd love to have tea with you sometime. Scott. The Pacific Northwest, August 27th of 2010. Midnight. Age 19. Carl Liambarto reached into his family-size bag of potato chips, mixed with trolley worms for extra flavor, held them above his open mouth, and waterfall dropped them in, wiping the grease from his fingers onto the security gate control panel and smearing the rest from his lips along his arm. A moment later his heart jumped a beat when he saw one of the lights on the panel lit up red. He moved forward, fidgeting at the buttons, but in doing so noticed it was only a reflective glint from the oily sheen on the plastic. He wiped his brow and laughed, musing on this lax job he'd acquired. Lax because he was assigned the night shift, when no one drove through except for on very rare occasions, he was told. Carl felt like a prince, reading his magazines and making calls until the sun came up, getting paid all the while. As he finished the last of his midnight snack, he started cleaning up by sticking his hand under the belly of his shirt and running it along the rim of the control panel like a makeshift sanitizer rag, only somewhat removing the top coat of potato chip grease. About an hour later, just as he drifted off to sleep, a frightening double tap from a car horn nearly jostled him off his chair, and with jangled nerves he tried to appear as though he hadn't been sleeping. Yes, sir. Or, madame, my apologies. I was, looking over the, scans here. Can I see some identification? The car window rolled down, and the visage inside caused momentary shock. The man in the car had a thick frame. His face looked permanently beaten, but he smiled and nodded his head pleasantly. Hello there. Haven't seen you around before, the man said. Carl instinctually looked to his left down the road in hopes that he wasn't truly alone with this stranger.
Yeah, so? So you're probably so new. He didn't tell you. Tell me what? Who? Who didn't tell me? The boss. Mr. Deeker? You mean Mr. Duncan, but that's all right. You'll get the hang of this name thing yet. Yeah, Duncan, that's right. Carl felt his tension alleviate. So you're with him? Yes, sir. Been with the good man for years, which is why I'm not the least bit surprised he forgot to explain all this to you. He rolled up his window and pulled his car to the side, got out and approached the toll booth, knocking on the entry door expectantly. Sir? Carl's voice was unsure once again. Don't worry. The man gave a thumbs up. This is required by company policy. Once a month I come by at around this time and do some maintenance on the security systems. Your only job is to let me in, and you're done. The security system? You mean the button that makes the gate open up? It works fine, see? Carl hit the switch and brought the gate open, then closed again. That, I'm afraid, is a common misconception. Just behind that little button you got the wires inside connecting everything. Plus there's the actual crank system, the threads, the motherboard, the engine, the brake system, the heating plates, and all that they bring. I could go on. Man, okay. Carl shook his head and shut his eyes before reopening them and forming an imaginary box with his hands for his next thought to play out in. What if, though... And stay with me here, but if you're like a test sent by the boss to make sure that I never let anyone in. I mean, it's my job to not let people in, just like it is my job to let people in. Does that make sense? What if I let you in tonight, then tomorrow I get, fired? Sure. Couldn't this also be a test to make sure you're not dumb enough to send me away? A moment later, Carl was unlocking the door and coming outside. The man tipped his invisible cap and smiled warmly as he came to the door with his satchel of tools and machine bits. Just be quick, whatever you're doing, Carl said, standing pensively in the gravel road. I don't like being outside here at night. Well, good news. You don't need to be here long. Get in your Mazda and head home, Carl. Your job is done. What are you talking about? When I come in, I take over. And you guys on duty get to go home early. It's gonna take me a long time to be thorough, so you, kid, may as well leave. Really? Carl smiled. Do I still get paid for the hours I would have worked? Not only that, my friend. The man pulled from his pocket a bouquet of banknotes. You're getting paid right now. As the money fanned out in the man's hand, a grin spread up across the left side of Carl's mouth as visions of tomorrow's beer run danced in his mind's eye. Cool, I guess. Thank you, then. And tell Mr. Mr. Duncan, I say hello and stuff. The boy walked away, counting his cash. As the Mazda peeled away, the rocks kicked up so hard, some of them flew into the road and pelted the man in the chest. He watched the boy drive out off until the sound of its engine shrunk away, and only the frogs and river water were left. Instead of heading inside his booth, or doing anything to check the mechanical health of the automatic gate system, he came to his car, opened the trunk, and pulled 2 duffel bags filled with nothing but extension cords. He picked one cord out and tossed its female end toward the gate, and walked the male end of the 100 feet of cable inside the booth and plugged it in underneath the switchboard. At 3:30 on the dot, the headlights appeared at the end of the street. The car itself did not come into view or become clear as one's eyes adjusted, but rather, as the headlights approached the gate, the rest of the Audi came to form, sprouting from its grills first and wrapping back into the bumper. It would have looked as though emerging from a fog of invisibility, silent at first, then, once closer, cacophonous, the horrible rattling, banging sound. It drifted to its stop at the security booth, just as all souls do, but inside was no one to bear witness. The thing behind the wheel, which at this time wore no eyes or nose or mouth, turned its head toward the driver's side window. Then no reaction, it turned toward the road, and might have started to begin driving. License and registration?
Scott descended upon the car from the passenger side window, wielding a smoke machine-sized flashlight, shining 10,000 lumens directly into the car. He wore black aviators and a bulletproof vest, leather-gloved hands, and a loaded pistol in his left hip holster. "Hello," the thing in the car said. In the instant the flashlight turned on, he had put on a face and was looking towards Scott and appraising him with lifeless green eyes. "How goes your night tonight?" "Waylon Wilf, you were in violation of the conditions for your pre-trial release, and I have a warrant out for your arrest, and you are not permitted on these premises by any means whatsoever. Step out of the vehicle now." "You're saying I'm in trouble? Or something?" The thing in the car's mouth morphed into a mocking frown. "Oh no. Did I miss a stop sign?" "Mr. Wilf, you were wanted for the murder of your wife and 2 children. If you would like any hope of a sympathetic judgment, you will exit your vehicle and never ever come back here again." No, you got the wrong guy. I'm not Waylon Wilf, buddy. I'm just here to see the flowers change." "Oh? You're not Waylon Wilf? So you don't remember me then?" "Remember you?" "Yeah, you're the guy with photos of your daughters in your wallet. That's what you tried to show me last time. But I don't want to see the pictures of your daughters. I want to see your hands in the air now." The thing turned rageful and then simply fell away. The air left Scott's lungs as he witnessed skin from its face and hands turn blue and blistered, swelling with gas and acid, and then bursting into shreds of moulding black wads. Eventually, only his skull, eyes, and oddly enough his hair were left, which now gently wafted above his head like seaweed underwater. The rapid change was like a fast-motion recording of his body degrading after the drowning, and was so distressing Scott was almost unable to look back at him. Only one thought, one triumphant thought, gave him the strength to turn back and meet the thing's horrible gaze, that his plan was probably working. "Ha, officer, I'm afraid you are still confused. You're not Waylon Wilf? Psychopathic weirdo, killed his family in Choukawa River, over there? You sure look like it. You look like a damn zombie." "Well, I mean, From his degrading skull, one eye turned grey-blue and then poured out of the socket like so much melted gummy worms. "Okay, I'll give you that. I am Waylon Wilf. It is a pleasure to meet you, sir. What did you say your name was again?" "I didn't, but my name is Scott Foley, hall monitor of John Ammond Catholic School, year of 73. "Well, officer, I don't know what you think I did, but you are ugly as hell, and I wish you would get out of my face." I so rarely get to say this in life, but look who is talking. "Hey, I'll give you that. Waylon laughed and bent his neck back. He slapped his knee in good fun, yet as he did, the slap itself seemed to shift the entire car he sat in. It jangled and bounced from side to side, and when it steadied again, it no longer sat steady on the road, but floated gently, as if it were in water. "Whoa!" Scott put his hand out in front of him, next to the flashlight. "Don't do that again. I don't want any sudden movements." "All I am are sudden movements." "Waylon, get out of the car." "But if I get out of the car..." The thing took its hands off the steering wheel, and again the car jangled and tipped from side to side, as if a supporting cord had just been snapped from it. "All the water inside will spill out. I'll get you all wet." "Hey, I wanted to ask, Waylon, where is your wife tonight? Sue Wilf. That's her name, Sue, right? How is she doing tonight?" "Couldn't say for sure. I mean, I'm not my better half's keeper. We could only pray for that, am I right?" "Is she in the back of your trunk?" Scott's hand slowly moved down to his holster, where he kept the pistol. "Would you mind if I just took a look back there?" "Took a look? In my trunk?" The thing twisted his head left to right indignantly, then started shaking his finger at Scott. "You have no right to look in my trunk. This is an obstruction of justice. Do you hear me? You are abusing your power of authority." The car jangled more and more, breaking free from invisible wires with each shake of the thing's hand. Scott finally had the gun in his hand and pointed it at the driver, cocked the hammer, and shouted one last warning. "If you don't step out right now, I'm going to see what happens when something like you gets shot." Before Scott could get a shot off, The car began to move, accelerating at 10 miles per hour. There was no time to stop him. As the thing moved away, Scott gasped and grasped for the window, but missed and sliced his finger on the back of its broken taillight. The Audi cruised forward through the gate without upset, as if it were made completely of fog, and yet Scott had just injured himself on its very real form. He sprinted across the road into the security booth and kicked aside the chair, reached for the gate key and twisted it, then pushed himself off the monitor and lunged back outside, running full speed toward the now opening gate. He reached his hand into his breast pocket and pulled a small black remote with only a single silver knob attached. He grabbed it like a wine cork and twisted so hard that it broke off. In a flash, a sextet of high-powered floodlights, connected through over 50 extension cords back into the booth and standing 5 foot high on steel black tripods, lit up a section of the bridge so bright it looked like day in the middle of the night. Scott's timing was impeccable, and just as he'd hit that switch, the Audi was perfectly in place between the floodlights' blaring trap. Scott left out a single bellowing laugh, seeing that the car had come to a stop, but just as quickly, the smile fell from his face and legs froze in place. He turned around, like a dog circling their spot on the couch, unable to decide what to do. Then, with a frustrated yell, he turned back the way he had just been sprinting and ran back that direction. His knees began to ache and hips began to buckle. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. He came to his car and his hand tore at the door handle, but it didn't open, and his fingers ripped back out painfully. Come on! He jammed his stinging hand in his pocket and pressed his car keys button without taking them out. Why would I need to lock it? Scott threw the door open and quickly grabbed the crowbar from the back seat and sprinted sloppily towards the bridge. His breathing now sounded forced and came with moans of pain as his sides were aching and his bad knee was forcing a slight limp as all of his hip muscles locked up. The car remained frozen in place by Scott's light trap, but a curse of pain ached from Scott's throat as he saw the car slowly moving again, as if pushing through the light like it was a wall of glue. Scott reached the back of the Audi just as it began to pick up speed, but managed to jam the crowbar into the trunk door and hold on for dear life as he ran behind. His legs could no longer take it, and he had no choice but to hold his feet still and surf on the asphalt. The soles of his shoes quickly degrade and soon would be shredded apart, only leaving the bottom of Scott's feet to be shredded next. Just as he felt the asphalt's tickle on the tip of his toes, he found the way to push all his weight down over the crowbar. Tensing his entire body, he jammed with 2 rapid thuds, and then on the third he leaned forward and pressed down with his chest, popping off the trunk flap clean off. Scott saw it but one moment. The dark water spilling out from the moss linen trunk just as it poured out from the bloated pores of the blue and green children. His body lost all strength, except to cover his eyes as a great light emanated from the car then. A single reverberating chord grew in volume, charming at first, but quickly unnerving as the noise grew until deafening. A wind kicked up so harshly, the sound of blowing became a stadium scream, and Scott screamed with it as he lay on the ground, his hands pressing on his ears. And then, on a dime, the chaos shut off. Scott took a moment, laying there, breathing in the calm, and recollected his sense of sanity with the river and night birds. He eventually sat up, studying each side of the road to make sure the thing was really gone. He saw and felt nothing, physically or otherwise. Scott turned off his flashlight, returned to his car, and drove from that place, knowing that he'd truly left it vacant for the first time in 20 years. Arnie Duncan was sitting at home looking through another stack of employment forms when he heard his phone ring from the other room. He ignored it and kept on smoking his cigar. It was a Friday night, his night to relax, and pretty soon he'd go into the other room and start watching TV. In fact, the movie he missed in theaters was playing on Channel 6, which he thought was the perfect excuse to ignore the call. But as his wife passed through the living room while giving him the look, he decided to just take care of business now. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Duncan said, smiling and shaking his head. "My caller ID is telling me that this is Scott Foley on the line. Boy,
I sure hope that's not a glitch. Mr. Duncan, how have you been? Scott said, a voice so immediately memorable Duncan laughed just at the sound of it. Sure has been a long time, hasn't it, sir? Well, sure has. I was starting to think I was never going to hear that voice of yours ever again. But I'm sure you didn't call just to chat. What is it, son? You need a letter of recommendation? That's very nice of you to offer, sir. Maybe another time. Actually, I'm calling about the reservation. What reservation? You have a reservation? With who? No, the reservation. The literal Shokewa Nature Reservation you manage. Oh, calling about that. You planning a little vacation in the woods for yourself? Come to think of it, you never did take advantage of the employee benefits. That's all right, though. I'll make sure you get the discount. Again, thank you, sir. That's very generous, but I'm not going camping. Really? Well, what's up? First of all, how is everything? I mean, with the city? Oh, he laughed. Oh, Scott, I don't know if you've heard, but we did it. It's being built. It? The Duke. It's finally gonna happen, and to be honest, it's hard to put into words how that feels. Wow. A brief pause in Scott's talking let Duncan know he was really affected. That's really incredible to hear, sir. I'm very happy for you. Yeah, well, it's all an accumulated effort, and there were a lot of days you were a big help to me, so it's partly due to you, son. Thank you. You don't need to thank me, sir. There's got to be something I could do, just to show you I appreciate it. Actually, Scott cleared his voice. This is going to sound a little strange. If you wanted to do anything for me, I think you should get in contact with whoever is in charge of the Waylon Wilf case. Do what now? Just contact those people and tell them to give another look in the Shokewa River. Give it one more look for his car. Maybe this time they'll finally find it. What? Duncan looked into the phone like it was a prank. I don't understand, Scott. I mean, why now? I was down there the other night doing some night fishing with my 10 grand lumens. Oh, Scotty, you know they got the sun for that kind of stuff. Well, I like to go at night and bring a big light, and I pointed it at the water, and I think I saw some kind of mass. I think, maybe, if they just go back and take one more sweep, they might come up with something. A pause. You saw something in the river. Well, I'm a little baffled why I have to do it, but sure, I'll do it. I think I get why you're asking me. Why's that? I know that we didn't end things on the best note, but I want you to know you were my favourite pupil. Truly. Well, Scott trailed off, and Arnie expected the worst, but was happily wrong. I want to apologize for the way I acted as well, and if truth be told, if you'd have me, I think I'm ready to maybe talk about coming back to work, if we can work something out? No. A smile grew on Duncan's face, like that of a boy on Christmas. This is quite a turn of events. You're saying I can go back in the other room and toss out all these pimply-faced applicants? Scott laughed. I don't see any reason why not. I only have one request as per my reinstatement. Shoot, buddy. I don't work full moons, Friday the 13th, entire last week of October, and graveyard shifts are out. Scott, if you want, I'll get you ordained and give you just the church hours.
Thank you for listening to In the Now Eventually. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.